Knock, knock. Renz knocked on the door of his aunt's house with his index finger's knuckle. The ring he was wearing hitting the aluminum caused an echo on the small porch. He didn't wait for a reply before opening the door gently. "I brought your favorite." The first thing he saw upon entering the home was his aunt posted in her usual spot. Her recliner, no doubt, had an indentation of her body perfectly, but it was hard to get her out of it most days. He had the light duty of keeping her company and bringing her food when he could. Luckily, he skipped the bathing duty, for now. "Adobo," the older woman feebly answered. If Renz would have been breathing any harder, he could have missed it. No," he sighed, but quickly donned a smile. "Your second favorite. I brought fresh pork barbecue," because it was the only thing still open. He sat the bag of food next to his aunt, knowing she'd probably wait until he left to eat. That's how it seems to work these days. But he was sure she was actually eating, so that was an improvement from a few weeks ago. He told himself he'd rather take out the trash a few more times a week versus cleaning the molding food from the fridge again. "I'd eat it while it's still fresh," Renz teased. "I'm starting to get hungry." His aunt mustered a raise in the corner of her mouth, reaching for the bag. The smell of cooked pork filled the living room immediately, overpowering the scent of dust accumulating. His family did the best they could to come by and clean so his aunt wouldn't have to, but nobody was able to be there every day. Losing her husband 5 years ago definitely changed something within her. She took a little longer to get out of bed some days, and stopped showing up to the family events for a few months. Eventually, she learned to find a way without him, because she still had Tito. Until she didn't. It wasn't but 3 years, nearly to this day later, that she lost him as well. Unlike his father, Tito decided to end his own life. Renz had a shiver down his spine just recalling the phone call Aunt Kim made to inform everyone. He was sure she meant for one of his parents to answer, as he didn't live with them anymore, but a part of him is glad that he was the one to receive the news first. That way he could spare everyone the complete details. The truth is, yes, Tito did take his own life. His mom wasn't sure if it was the constant jumping in and out of rehab, or his recent bankruptcy status, or even still coping with the loss of his father. Renz was sure she most likely went through every scenario at least 1,000 times. But what he would never share with his aunt was the last meaningful conversation he had with his cousin. Not only was he trying to come to reality with his business venture failing, which sent him into a rehab, which he promptly checked himself out of, but his girlfriend left him after that too. From what it sounded like, she had just had enough with his addiction battle. It was less of a battle, and more of him saying he would get better and failing to do so. Renz said he can't blame her, but it was definitely the catalyst. He smiled at his aunt eating in front of him, and took it as a small victory. His reward was a seat on the nearby couch. His train of thought was, if he acted like he had one foot out the door, maybe his aunt would eat sooner, and it seemed to have worked. His mind jerked him back onto the less than pleasant train of thought, that last conversation he had with his cousin Tito. "I don't know about that, man." He could tell his cousin needed moral support, but it was 3 a.m. in the middle of his work week. Some of us still had jobs to get to.
"That's just how I see it,"
Tito scoffed.
"I knew you'd find some sort of silver lining."
"I just think you should cut her some slack." Renz rolled over, shoving his head under his pillow, as if that would magically end the phone call. "You've both been through a lot."
"Yeah."
His response was met with a harsh silence on both ends.
"Thanks anyway."
And that was that. The last time he would hear from his cousin before taking his own life. And it was spent with Tito trying to convince Renz that his mother Kim was at the root of all of his misfortune. The only thing that Renz could pinpoint that she even had a hand in was refusing to lend Tito money again. It was out of both love and principle, because she didn't know whether it would go to rent or drugs, and chose to play it safe. It made Ren sick that this was the thought process his cousin took to his grave. He took a quick glance to the mantle, the final resting place to both his uncle and cousin now. This was quickly picked up by his aunt, who conveniently sat right across from him. She let out a sigh, placing the food she had in her hand back in the box. She offered it to him without saying anything, but upon declination, set it on the coffee table, exhausting what energy she did have. Not that he could blame her. It has been only 4 months since the passing of her son, and 3 years since the loss of her husband. He had put himself in her shoes many times, and remains thoroughly impressed with where she is now. Still, it hurts seeing his aunt like this. There was very little improvement from day to day, and Renz made the conscious effort to see her at least 3 times a week. It was the least he could do, but no amount of food he could provide her washed away the guilt he felt for having to do it in the first place. Renz went home that night much later than he intended. He waited until Kim was audibly snoring, before covering her with a blanket and planting a kiss on her forehead. He thought he saw a twitch of her mouth turning upward, but chalked it up to his imagination, and quickly exited just as he had come. That was the new normal for now. Renz would bring the food that was once his aunt's favorite in hopes that her appetite would return over time. For the most part, it had, but not until almost a year later. It was around that time that she was starting to get her mobility back, and the other family members stopped coming by as frequently. Despite his aunt's protestations at times, Renz still visited just as often. Periodically, he would take an extra day off of work or call in late just to stay overnight with her during the tragic anniversaries. There are things you don't think about until you have no other choice. What to do when it comes to the deceased's birthday, marriage anniversary, or even when they should have graduated college. Still, she had a long way to go. The loss of her immediate family has left her fragile, to say the least. Her night terrors were a bit less frequent as the time has moved on, but they were still present. Renz had gotten used to them by now, but the sound of his aunt wailing after screaming herself awake wasn't something he would soon forget. A main concern that her closest friend addressed was the fact that she still lived in the residence she shared with her husband and son. She had primarily taken up the residence in her living room, so her bedroom and son's room would remain virtually untouched. It was all Renz could do to convince his Aunt Kim to allow him to move in a futon, so she would have another option for sleeping other than her recliner. She fought with him every step of the way, but started using it as soon as it was set up. That was enough to win for him. That's why when his aunt called him with the news, it was all he could do to not drop the phone. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You want to sell the house?"
Yes.
He could hear her smile from the other end.
I just accepted an offer on it, dear.
What? How? Normally, he has no issue supporting the endeavors of his family, especially his aunt, but this was completely out of character considering how they spent the last few years. She was just to the point of being able to spend a few hours outside the house every so often, and now she wanted to sell it.
There's no need to get upset, son.
Renz felt the pit in his stomach every time his aunt referred to him as her son. It wasn't an uncommon occurrence, even before the death of her own, considering how close they were, but it held a different weight now.
I'm thinking about moving closer to everyone. I think it's time.
Auntie, I have no problem making that trip,
It's time.
she repeated.
There are a lot of memories here, but I think it's come to an end. And I think it's what Jericho would have wanted.
Well, Renz sighed, becoming increasingly aware of how sweaty his hand was while holding the phone. I can't argue with that. But what on God's green earth gave you this idea in the first place?
Mila showed me a wonderful mobile home.
The lightness in her voice was refreshing.
I can have it moved anywhere I want.
Are you trying to move in with me? He said, half-jokingly. He told his dear aunt countless times she should.
I wouldn't burden you with that, sweet Wrens.
She meant well, but that sentence hung in the air heavily. Before he could argue, she said she had to go, and quickly disconnected the call. Whether or not that was necessarily true was up for debate, but they both knew she didn't want to get caught up in an argument. It wasn't before long the older woman stayed true to her word. She did sell the home she spent 2/3 of her life in rather quickly. Kim moved closer to the rest of her family, while still maintaining a distance. She was about an hour and a half away from Wren's home instead of 3, so neither of them could complain. Not that she was able to stay home long. It was almost like a snowball effect. Once she was settled in her trailer for a few weeks, she got a second wind. She talked of traveling to places that she had once been with her family. Wren's tried softly to talk her out of it at first, thinking it could do more harm than good. But after the first trip, it was apparent that it was exactly what she needed in order to grieve. While she did have a habit of springing the location of the trip on others, the family would get updates like clockwork. It was always a bittersweet phone call or message with the occasional postcard. She made sure to include pictures of her husband, son, or all 3 of them side by side with her in the present day. Funny though, even though the years have added sagging skin and more laugh lines, her smile remained the same. It was a comforting, albeit shiver-inducing thought. But nobody was able to successfully pinpoint why. The frequency of her trips died down when she started to run lower than she'd like on money. She still had a good bit set aside from what was left from selling the house, but she insisted on keeping it above a certain amount religiously. No one ever questioned it, at least to her face. When she revealed that she got a part-time job just down the block from where she lived, it was met with relief rather than apprehension. Nobody was able to object with the complete turnaround she had made. Healing is not linear, but her good days far outnumbered the bad ones. Life was able to carry on as close to normal as one grief-stricken family was able to. That was until the pandemic struck. The news was met with total chaos worldwide, throwing everyone into a frenzy if they had previously scheduled travel plans. Reluctantly, Kim's most recent trip to Thailand was going to be rescheduled for some unknown date in the future. The news seemed to get her down in spirits, along with needing to quit her part-time job in order to retain her own safety. That was done with a bit more pleading from her family than she would like to see, but she made the decision a mere week into the pandemic. Within 3 more, she was not given much choice than to move in with her sister and her family, which just happens to include her favorite nephew. While she was surprisingly hesitant at first to live in a full house again, she quickly adapted once she accepted that nobody was able to travel anywhere for the near future. It was not long after they moved his aunt in that Wrens noticed the unfamiliar behavior she had adopted. At first, he was a little unsettled by the fact that she was insistent on setting 2 extra spots at the table each night. When first asked about it, she smiled that award-winning smile and replied, "They're for my husband and son." And that was that. Nobody tried to argue the fact and simply agreed it was a method of grief. What was a few extra dishes in comparison to her happiness anyway? It didn't take long for whoever was preparing the dinner that night to cook just a little extra for the 2 empty plates. It always looked so pristine next to the silverware and glasses that went untouched. One night, Wrens was letting his mind get the best of him, and he found himself fixated on the plates that were across from him. His aunt, like before, was quick to catch wind of his gaze. "They're for Jericho and Tito," she said, in a not-so-hushed tone, reaching out to place her hand on his arm. This caught the attention of her sister and brother-in-law, but she continued.
They're excited to be here with us.
Oh, they are. Renz raised his eyebrow, trying hard not to let the disbelief show while making eye contact with his parents.
Of course. We're with family.
She gave his arm another pat before retreating back to her plate.
They're with me everywhere I go, and they've been happy to see you.
It was hard to argue with her respectful nod and cheerful smile. There wasn't a doubt in his mind that she meant what she said. Could they really be around somehow? He shook the thought out of his head as quickly as it appeared. That's not possible. Renz quickly scalded himself for entertaining childish thoughts before excusing himself from the table. He did his best to put it past him until things started to get a little too weird for him to ignore. A few months into the pandemic, the behaviors from his Aunt Kim escalated from more than just leaving a few extra dishes out. On more than one occasion, Renz caught her facing the wall and carrying on a conversation. He decided to not think much of it until his mother, who was growing increasingly concerned, let him know that she was an audience to this behavior too. Only, she had the need to address it with her sister. She gave a similar response to when she was asked about the extra places at the table initially. Except this time, her response was a bit more curt. This was enough for it, again, to be swept under the rug. Who was anyone to judge her grieving process anyway? That was the common consensus until things were escalating at a more rapid pace. In a passing conversation, Kim made mention to both Renz and his mother that her husband and son were willing her to do things. It's as if she was unable to make a decision for herself without consulting the thin air first. There were a few happenings told in passing that made Ren's hair stand up on the back of his neck. He wasn't sure which one was cause for more concern, or if they should have been equal. Kim made mention of a pair of cross earrings she found tucked away in the room she took residence in. It was a guest room for years, filled with various knickknacks and the lone storage box. But something told her that she was going to find the pair of earrings in a box, and before she knew what she was doing, she already had them on. From that day, she hadn't taken them off, claiming it was a gift from her son, Tito. A little more out of the ordinary, the room was beginning to take up a foul smell. Upon a quick inspection while Kim was in the shower, Renz found a few McDonald's bags on the nightstand. He barely opened one before getting the fright of his life.
Joe asks me to get him his favorite every Friday.
Aunt Kim's voice rang loud and clear, the only other sound in the room being the blood rushing to his ears from being caught.
You know how he was about sandwiches.
I do. Renz faked a smile, folding the bag back up and placing the moldy food back where he found it. I'm sorry for snooping. More like sorry I got caught. Why are you keeping this in here? He thought to himself.
Don't be, dear.
The now slightly eerie smile dawned on her face again.
Just don't eat your uncle's food.
This sentence definitely made him stop in his tracks. Or was it the fact that she now had a grip on his arm as he tried walking past?
He loves you like his own son, you know.
The eye contact his aunt was making while stating the fact was unsettling to say the least. I know, Auntie. I loved him too. He quickly made a beeline for the exit, his heart still racing at what seemed twice the normal speed. Why would she say loves? There hadn't been anything present tense about his uncle for half a decade now. All of this was adding up to something, but he still couldn't place his finger on what bothered him most about it. Isn't nearly 60 too old for imaginary friends? Another month went by with something out of the ordinary happening at a frequent rate. It wasn't anything they couldn't handle, until it was. Renz awoke one night, hearing hushed murmurs coming from downstairs. He warred with himself on whether or not he should see what was going on, but he could tell it was his aunt doing the talking. He finally decided to go pay her a visit, with the ruse of getting a cup of water to drink. He tiptoed downstairs, being careful not to put all of his weight on his feet just yet. He even caught himself covering his mouth to ensure that he was able to control his breathing. Despite all the preparation, he wasn't ready for what he was met with when he reached the dining hall. It was his aunt, yes. Her hand was fixated tightly around a mug of what could only be tea at this hour. Renz watched as she seems to carry on a conversation with someone, except no one else was there but her. She even went as far as to giggle like a little girl and swats the absent air beside her, like she had just heard an amusing anecdote. As if this wasn't odd enough for him, she was sitting in complete darkness. There was just the light over the sink in the kitchen, which was barely enough to show any particular detail in their surroundings. He thought about calling out her name to grab her attention and bring her back to reality, but before he could, he heard his uncle's name escape her lips. It often did, but this was not the same. It's as if she was speaking to him directly. The laughter stopped on a dime as he inched forward. Once he entered the dining room, he was stopped dead in his tracks. Even though he swore she was just looking to her left, she was now facing completely forward and staring directly at him. The smile on her face was gone. In the most unsettling fact, she looked rather angry with him, as if he had interrupted an important conversation. Enough was visible to see the white around his aunt's knuckles from how tight she was now gripping the mug. He half expected it to shatter right before him with the force she seemed to be exerting. Instead of audible speaking, Renz merely motioned back upstairs feebly as a chill went down his spine. He kept eye contact with his aunt the entire trip back, aside from when he reached the stairs. What realistically took a few seconds felt like an hour with how tense the air was. He made a mental note of how she didn't even seem to blink the entire time they locked gazes. He wasn't able to get much sleep that night. Whenever he did manage to nod off, he was reminded of the expression he last saw on his aunt's face. This caused him to pry himself out of bed quite later than he normally would, but he felt more calm going downstairs when he heard his family rustling about. Before he could even think about mentioning it to anyone, he took a quick note of his aunt still taking up residence in the dining room. But this time, she smiled warmly and patted the empty seat next to hers for him to join. He sat next to her, albeit reluctantly. Even though she appeared to be in her normal state of mind now, there was an unsettling air about her that he now couldn't shake. He waited until his parents had gone to work before trying to address the matter with her, but it only seems to make the thoughts racing in his mind worse.
Oh, I don't know, dear. I was out like a light last night.
Are you sure? He pressed, making the effort to take her plate of breakfast into the kitchen for her. It was a nice gesture, but it was really to avoid being in the same room at the moment.
I could have sworn you were enjoying a cup of tea.
That sounds like me.
She laughed with a cheerful smile to follow.
But I'm certain I was asleep. Are you sure it wasn't just a dream?
I guess it must have been, Renz sighed, second-guessing the last few hours and tracing his steps back again and again as he continued to keep busy cleaning up the kitchen. It had to have been a dream, right? That was a question he repeated to himself for a few days before trying to lay it to rest for good. He could find no reasonable explanation that didn't make him sound insane. Eventually, Renz found that he was finally able to get a good night's sleep, as long as he locked his door before laying down for the night. It kept things in and out. Life almost returns to normal for a day, before the family was met with shocking news. Kim called a meeting at that same dining room table, informing her family that both her husband and son were getting a little restless.
They need to get some fresh air,
she explained. The rebuttal everyone had wasn't even about the fact that she was once again addressing her deceased family in the present tense, but with the fact that there was still a global pandemic at large and someone of her age should not be traveling alone.
I won't be alone,
she snapped.
I will never be alone.
I'm telling you. Renz's mother placed her hand lovingly on her sister's shoulder. Her voice was sweet, but her gestures indicated how tired she actually was with trying to talk some sense into her sister. It's not safe out there right now. Please consider waiting a little longer.
We've waited long enough,
was the only response they got before she retreated to the guest room. Kim was wasting no time in packing her things, which was even more unlike the person she is. She always took her time, even if it meant packing a week beforehand. It was extremely out of character for those decisions to be made in such haste. She was intent on leaving the next day. Everyone stayed home from their jobs in an attempt to talk some sense into her, but it was futile. Renz was beginning to come to terms with her desire to leave. In fact, it was a little comforting taking her odd behaviors into consideration. Maybe a little time apart wouldn't be so bad. Kim managed to gather all of her belongings and have them waiting at the door before everyone was even awake the following day. But, as she told them, they shouldn't worry. She got a flight for that night so she could have time to treat them for an early dinner to thank them for their hospitality. Although Renz took note of the way it was speaking, it almost made it seem like this would be the last time they would see her. Just as she had done for the past year almost, she added 2 extra spaces at the table for her husband and son. But before Renz had time to finish even half his food, he noticed that the spaces across from him looked as if the food had been sitting there for weeks. The glasses that were full just a moment ago were now bone dry. The food on the plate was now green, covered in white specks of mold. He blinked his eyes, complete with rubbing them for a few seconds just to make sure he was seeing things correctly. Still there. His mother and father wouldn't look up from their plates, so he wasn't able to gesture over to the placemats in order to get a second opinion. His gaze was only met with his aunt's, with her same unnerving smile stretching from ear to ear.
They are enjoying their meal, dear. Aren't you?
She asked, gesturing to his nearly full plate. Renz's eyes turned back to his plate, preparing another bite in order to appease his aunt. She had worked hard on this last meal for them, and it would be rude to let any more of it go to waste. But it took all of his will in order to not drop the fork on the plate when his eyes registered what they were seeing. His food, too, was now riddled with mold. The only difference was he had a few maggots that appeared in the blink of an eye. With his heart now clear in his stomach and his heart racing fast, he took another look up at his dear aunt. He was met with that same cold, dead stare as he saw that night a month prior. Only this time, it was accompanied with that chilling grin. Immediately, Renz was hit with the realization that the night in question wasn't just a dream, was it? The rest of that evening and following weeks were all a blur. He wasn't sure if it was the inability to sleep or the fact that he wasn't even able to sit in a dark room anymore. His parents were growing ever annoyed and a little concerned that he kept his room light on every second of the day. But his restlessness was apparent with the bags under his eyes and his lack of cognitive ability, so they let it go, just like they had with his aunt. He was opening the mail one morning, sorting through a thick pile, seeing as it's been a week since he was able to bring himself to fetch it. His heartbeat quickened while it sunk to his feet this time, when he caught the familiar handwriting in his peripheral vision. It was the latest postcard from his aunt.
"We miss you, dear,"
was written in bold letters up at the top, with a small bits detailing her most recent adventure. But the most unsettling part was the picture she taped to the postcard instead of the usual scenery. It was a picture of her, in front of what would normally have been a beautiful bridge. But the kicker was that Kim had that same terrifying and almost inhuman smile and glazed look in her eyes. The fact that it was caught on film solidified the reality of it all. Renz didn't even have time to think of who even took the picture for her before one daunting thought flashed across his mind. Maybe Tito was right. Maybe Aunt Kim was the cause of his misfortune.